Hey everyone, it's been a while. Welcome to LR lesson number 9. Today's subject is choosing the less terrible answer. Specifically, I'll be talking about two things that I do using the general form of the assumption, which actually was featured in the previous lesson in the series, as well as something that I kind of do in passing, but I don't really make a huge deal out of it. But I do specifically use another tool, which I'll just refer to as measuring logical distance. And we'll be working out of PT84's second LR section. So for me, I believe that is PT84 section 3, questions 17 and 23. So goals for today. In so many of the most frustrating and difficult LR questions, students, myself included, struggle to find reasons to either select or, in many cases, just avoid outright eliminating a problematic correct answer. We've all been there before. Shortly before and after the April 2024 exam this year, my inbox got hit extremely hard by people, current students, prospective students, just people looking for consultations, folks asking for help with this specific issue of bad correct answers. How do I not eliminate it, and how do I make peace with actually selecting it? Those are kind of two sides of the same coin, right? In particular, for one of these students, I fairly recently made a very involved write up of a number of LR questions that they had sent me, and I thought two things that I did from that pretty involved write up were worth sharing with the rest of you. So here we are today. And so the situation I described, again, to reiterate, it's how do I identify a quote unquote bad answer as correct? Or at least how do I learn not to eliminate it? I use two tools to defeat that situation. The first is, again, something that I've mentioned in previous videos, which is the general form of the assumption, which I'll abbreviate henceforth as GFA. GFA allows you to keep an open but still controlled mind regarding answer choices that contain outside information. So for easier questions in the beginning of the section, very often we'll just very quickly eliminate an answer because it brings up outside information in a scenario where it's not acceptable, right? Outside of strengtheners and weakeners, generally speaking, we are deeply suspicious of information that comes out of nowhere. And so they use that against us on harder questions, but GFA allows you to regain control of that situation. The second tool, again mentioned on the title slide, and here it is again, measuring logical distance, which I'll abbreviate to MLD. When both of the remaining answer choices require some amount of stretch to work, whichever one of those two offers even the most minimal assistance in making that stretch, that's the better answer. So we'll start with GFA, and the question I think that is a good example of how to use it is PT84 Section 3, question number 23. This one is a flawed question. So the stimulus goes something like the first premise, all currently proposed regulations will reduce trade deficit. Uh, yeah, so it just flat out says it will reduce the trade deficit. So this is a guarantee. It's not a some other regulations maybe reduce the deficit. We are told flat out by our politician, every regulation, each every single one of them is going to have this effect. Okay, so that's pretty solid. Premise two, we get a similarly fairly clear premise about trade deficit in the economy. The country's trade deficit is so large that it weakens the economy. No ifs, ands, or buts. It just does it. The trade deficit is so large that it just straight up weakens the economy. There's no qualification for it. This is just reality as it is. Okay, so this is already a sign that things might be kind of hard unless they throw us a bone in the conclusion. So let's see what they do there. Our conclusion is therefore each one of the currently proposed regulations would help the economy. And that's a problem for me because both premise one and premise two are just spitting straight up facts. There's no wiggle room. There's no maybe some. There's none of that. It's all just this does happen. This does happen. This is the case. And the conclusion takes a similar like, hey, that this would be the case. That there's similarly no wishy-washiness. So my analysis of that stimulus is that I reached for the GFA immediately because all of this sounds okay to me. We know the deficit weakens the economy according to premise two, and we know each of the regulations reduces this economy weakening deficit. We get that from premise one. We just know these things. They are not up for question. So it seems reasonable to me to conclude that for sure reducing something, in this case, the deficit, that is for sure weakening the economy, that in turn will for sure help the economy. So there's probably some more technical official explanation type way to take issue with the stimulus, and that might revolve around the word help, which kind of comes out of nowhere if we want to really look at it that way. But I mean, if you see that, great, more power to you. I'm not being dismissive. It's just, If you see it, literally, that's great. But the rest of us don't. I don't. Not in a million years would I really instinctively see that. That being said, even though we don't see it, we can still get it right. So that's what this discussion is going to be about. So GFA, that strategy, the general form of the assumption, tells us that our arguer simply assumes that their premises are enough to support the conclusion. And I just realized here that I should probably link to the GFA video. I'll throw that up in the upper right corner. Maybe I won't use a card. I'll actually use like a thumbnail, whatever it is. I'll link it up there just so you have some context for what the GFA is. But suffice it to say here that what the GFA tool leads us to do here is to see that our arguer simply assumes their premises are enough to support the conclusion. And the implication of that is that nothing else outside of the regulations reduce the deficit, situation, that nothing else outside of that need be added to the premises to make this whole thing work. So again, another way of putting it is our arguer just assumes that they've told us the whole story that matters, that we don't need to account for anything else. That's specifically what the GFA tells us in this situation. So what I'm looking for in a correct answer is an answer that provides something outside of the regs reduced deficit kind of situation that calls into the question the idea that the regulations will in fact help the economy. So the conclusion again is that the regulations will in fact help the economy. And so I am looking for a reason that is outside of what they've provided us in the stimulus, which is that the fact that regulations reduce the deficit. So I'm looking for something outside of that that calls into question the idea that the regulations are actually going to help. Which again shouldn't be that mind blowing. It's just kind of just a restatement of what's going on, added to the fact that this is a flaw stimulus. So importing that, quote unquote pre-phrase that I came up with at the end of the last slide into our analysis here, I do want to stop to make an important note. We are normally deeply suspicious of outside information when it comes to assumption based stimuli that are not of the strengthen or weaken type. Those two are the only places where we're sort of by default fairly accepting of outside info. Everywhere else, we don't really like it. And I want to emphasize that this is fine. Keep doing that. In fact, ruthlessly eliminating such answer choices early in their section on easy or medium questions, that's a great way to save time and move efficiently through the NLR section. So the question is now, so why am I suddenly abandoning that same suspicion here? And the answer is GFA. On easier questions, I'm almost always able to come up with something that the stimulus got obviously wrong, using 3 out of the 4 assumption patterns that I discussed in the previous LR lesson, number 8. Um, those situations are not GFA scenarios, and thus in those situations, I remain unforgiving towards outside information that appears in the answer choices. But when I can't find such an obvious vulnerability, I immediately reach for GFA, and that's my sign that I'm going to relax my general abhorrence for outside information. So, in other words, whenever I can't clearly identify a vulnerability, that leads me to think of the GFA, and the GFA in turn, what that does is it lowers my standards regarding outside information. Again, I'm not like gung ho about taking that stuff on, but I am now no longer going to be immediately eliminating things. I will look at that outside information and attempt to process it a little bit. But everything outside of this clear chain of reasoning that involves the GFA, I remain suspicious of outside information. All right, so now getting into the actual analysis of the answer choices. Starting with A, how does it stack up against my pre-phrase of, something that provides an outside of regulations reduced deficit relationship, something other than that, that calls into question the idea that the regulations are actually going to help somehow. So I'm getting rid of A. There's absolutely no mention of which direction the deficit is moving or is going to go without intervention. That doesn't seem to matter. This is just all conjectural about, hey, the regulations have this property. The trade deficit, in turn, has this property. And so because the regulations have this property of being bad for or, reducing trade deficit, there's nothing about where the deficit is growing or shrinking and anything like that. These similarly in elimination, there's just absolutely no mention of deficit reduction being the only way to help the economy. It certainly is perhaps a way to help, at least possibly, but that's all we get. We don't know that there's no exclusion of other possibilities. Clearly, they haven't taken the time to tell us about these other possibilities, but in the way that they've written it, they are not, you know, they're not leaving closed the possibility that something else might be out there. C is also elimination. There's absolutely no appeal of authority to any kind whatsoever. That's just not a thing here. D. D is a winner. This is exactly the sort of thing that our GFA prephrase, as loosely as I use that word, it's what our prephrase leads us to. Since the stimulus seemed unassailable, everything that happens in the premises happens for sure, with zero limitations or qualifications. Because of that, we had to resort to considering things that were outside of the regulations reduced deficit relationship that was set up. And we had to consider those things as potential challenges to the idea that the regulations do, in fact, help the economy. Note here, very importantly, that I am not actually bothering to figure out exactly what kind of stuff that outside information is. I am only interested in what that outside information does, which is, again, specifically to act as a counterbalance to the unchallengeably beneficial aspect of the regulations, which again is that regulations reduce deficit. That, as far as the premises tells, that's going to reduce or act against the weakening effect of the trade deficit. So it is going to help. And as an added bonus, D here similarly doesn't actually bother to define what that outside information actually is. It just mentions that it's there. And that significantly reduces the chance that D overstretches. So, yeah, as D says, literally fails to consider the possibility that one effect of a regulation, which is, the effect that we know that regulations have, weakening the economy, um, will be offset by other effects. They don't tell us what those other effects are, and that actually makes it better. It's not going out on a limb. It's reducing the possibility of error, in my opinion. And so finally, to round things out, when we get to E, there's that's another easy elimination. There's absolutely no parts versus whole problem. The arguer specifically points out in the beginning that every regulation has this deficit reduction property. And the conclusion is again pointing out that each and every regulation, not the regulations as a collective group, they're calling out each individual regulation, are therefore going to help the economy. So there's never been a shift between the parts and the whole. This is just not it. So really, if you focus on eliminations, this one probably isn't going to be too challenging for a lot of you guys. But really, the thing about D is that it's just the other effects thing, right? The outside information. You guys really, really are very faithful and fastidious about not liking outside information. But just look at the situation. All the others are wrong. Um, and so you have to learn to give yourself a way to recognize when D, which normally contains markers of incorrectness, is actually what we're looking for here. And that's what the GFA is. So now let's move to a different question in the same section, number 17. And that's where we will be looking at the second tool that I discussed today, which is measuring logical distance, or MLD. So in this particular case, question number 17 is a paradox question. And so let's unpack the stimulus a little bit. Um, Instead of calling them premises, I just call them elements because it's technically not an argument, right? So the first element of this stimulus is that mosquito larvae, which I'll just say ML for short, they're aquatic. And so they tell us that as a result of that, mosquito-borne diseases generally increase after wet weather. All right, nothing particularly weird there. Element two, they're telling us, kind of strangely, mosquito-borne diseases in wetlands areas increase after droughts, which is, in case you didn't know, droughts refer to extremely dry weather, dangerously dry weather, in fact. So, what to unpack about this? I mean, while I haven't figured out if what I do here is 100% reliable and applicable, generally what I do is I treat the first element as a premise of sorts in paradox questions. What this means is that I treat element 2 as the element that bears the burden of explaining itself somehow. Um, Element two is the odd one out, and that's the one where I'm going to focus. I'm going to try to justify that. And again, I'm not sure that this is always the best way to do it. It is the way that I do it and hasn't really let me down, but I just want to put that caveat out there. That's what I'm going to do here, but I'm not, I haven't really tested this. Well, I haven't really bothered to test it explicitly over the years, but it hasn't let me down yet, so I'm just going to keep doing it. And I just want to say, this isn't particularly mind blowing, right? And from the looks of it, actually, most of you guys tend to do the same anyways without me having to instruct you. I'm just putting this out here because I make that choice explicitly and immediately. So it brings my focus to what I consider to be the most helpful area as soon as possible, which is again, I just focus myself on trying to justify element two. I'm not really challenging element one in any way. And so as for coming up with the prephrase, as is fairly typical for me on paradox questions, I start really, really like even comically simple. The correct answer I'm looking for introduces some outside information that explains how mosquito-borne diseases in wetlands increase after droughts, which again is just kind of a repackaging of the fact that element two does not match element one. I mean, it really is almost nothing, right? I don't stop there. I at least attempt to push one step forward from here. Much like my approach to almost any sort of pre-phrase that incorporates outside information, and you saw how I did this on question 24, um, or question 23, excuse me, on the previous slides, I am not going to put any real effort into guessing what that outside information actually is. That's not what I'm going to do. Instead, I keep my focus on what the outside information ideally does, which leads me to two broad alternatives, kind of refining my quote unquote preface. The first sort of alternative is that the outside information, when combined with drought conditions, confers some sort of advantage to the mosquitoes. Or the second alternative is that the outside information, when combined with drought conditions, confers some sort of disadvantage or susceptibility to the recipients slash targets of mosquito-borne diseases. So either mosquitoes are assisted in doing their job, their disease spreading job better, or the people getting diseases, or people, animals, whatever, getting diseases become weakened by drought somehow and yeah, become more susceptible. Those seem to be the two broad possibilities. So again, I don't know what outside information is going to be relevant. I'm not limiting myself to any particular scenarios, but I do understand what that outside information, whatever they choose to make it, has to perform one of these two tasks on some level. It's important to do. Um, so before kind of closing this out, I do want to briefly revisit C here. So for me, because we eliminated all the others and C at least had that green text, which I considered something that was going in its favor, that's enough for me personally to pick an answer. However, I can again predict the, if not angry, at least frustrated emails coming in, right? You guys, but James, you never actually resolved the objections you had to see. And that's true. I did not. I did not formally resolve the potential, complication that we were just assuming that other factors don't outweigh the potential benefits of the aquatic predators doing worse. I didn't resolve that. I didn't say that we know this for sure, which is fine. I don't need to because again, the issue is not for C. The issue is not this answer is wrong unless we're told something that makes it unwrong. That's the problem that E had. E was wrong and had no relationship between new plants and mosquitoes survival unless we had a specific information giving us the green light, signing off on it. But C, rather, is this scenario. This answer, as written, it's right on its face, unless this other stuff comes up to make it wrong. Those are two different situations. You need to start being able to recognize how C is therefore objectively better than E in that regard. So, takeaways. We've all seen it before on harder LR questions. Even the correct answer seems problematic or at least very difficult to like. And as I showed here, I usually use two tools to choose the correct answer in these scenarios. GFA is the first one, and the MLD is the second one. And so the GFA, to just kind of recap it real quickly, the special thing about GFA is that it allows you to keep an open mind regarding answer choices that contain outside information. Again, normally, and even in these situations, we don't really like outside information, but when the GFA triggers, that's your sign that okay, we're probably looking at a situation where I'm gonna have to at least engage with outside information on some level. Outside information doesn't make the answer automatically wrong. The second tool, MLD, um, this one is kind of more broadly applicable. It's going to help you in those situations where you're maybe down to two answers. Both of them require a stretch of some kind, and you just have no idea how to choose between the stretch. So, on question 17, I can imagine that a lot of you were stuck between E and C because you could kind of detect that A, B, and D all have the same problem. But C and E both have stretches. You look at aquatic predator and you're like, man, I don't know anything about aquatic predators. And then you look at new plant growth, and go, man, I don't know anything about new plant growth. How am I ever going to choose between these two? And I just showed you how the aquatic the aquatic predators, the word aquatic has a certain meaning to it, and drought has a certain meaning to it. And we put those two things together, things that are aquatic don't like droughts. Droughts suck when it comes to aquatic animals. So you don't need to invent that link. That's a link that exists just by the nature of the words themselves as written. And the only possible complication to that, it's correct until proven otherwise. Whereas the relationship between new plant growth and mosquito larvae, that one's incorrect unless proven otherwise. We have no basis for saying that they have any relationship whatsoever unless we get something that makes it that takes away the incorrect label from it. So C starts correct, but has the shadow of something making it potentially incorrect. That's better than an answer that, as written, is incorrect, and only when we add stuff to it becomes correct. Those are two very different situations. So GFA is pretty straightforward. Like I said, it's meant to serve entirely as a mental trigger that tells you when to stop automatically rejecting outside information. And MLD, like I closed out my previous slide with, it's a you have to learn to do it for yourself kind of tool. The best I can do is, I believe at least, what I've done here, which is to show you that it's at least possible to distinguish between gap sizes. And after that, it's up to you to figure out how to fine tune that and calibrate it to match your particular language needs. And so you made it to the end. Thanks for watching. As always, you know how to get a hold of me through this email on the screen here. Leave a comment, or as most of you choose to seem to do, leave me an email if you have questions. But yeah, I'll see you in the next one.